Good afternoon, everybody. While you get settled in, I just want to introduce myself again. Ruth Huffbauer. I'm the director of the graduate degree program in ecology, and I'm really happy for our second in-person Distinguished Ecologist seminar. Thank you very much for braving the cold and the wind to get here. As somebody who biked in, I know it was not easy. And with that, as soon as Ed finishes taking his notes, he's done, I will let Ed introduce our speaker.
Okay, I just had to work out some of the punchlines to my better jokes, sorry. I have no jokes. Okay, it's a real honor and pleasure to have Alonso Ramirez here from North Carolina State University. I'll give you a little history of Alonso's academic path. Born and raised in Costa Rica, bachelor's degree from the Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Went on then to work as a technician at La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica for a couple years, and during that time met Kathy Pringle, who invited him to come do a master's at the University of Georgia. So he completed his master's degree in 1997, went on to complete a PhD degree at the University of Georgia, and finished that in 2001. After that, he moved to the University of Puerto Rico as an assistant professor, spent 17 years there, went all the way to full professor, and during that time he was a scientific director at the El Verde field station at the University of Puerto Rico for most of the time. So then a job opened at North Carolina State University. The story is that he applied, but applied a little bit late after they're already interviewing people. So because of the caliber of scientists that Alonso is, they just made a new job for him. That happens all the time. That never happens. And that was in 2018. So he's been at NC State since 2018. He was the president of the Society of Freshwater Science during the roughest pandemic years, 2020 to 2021, carrying the society through those turbulent times. And in 2012, he also founded a network called Macro Latinas, so Latin American researchers focusing on freshwater resources. And that group is going to have its 10th year anniversary this year. It's been very successful. They have 550 members networked all across Latin America. So lots of accomplishment, really impressive body of work, and it's just a real pleasure to have him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramirez.
Thank you. Now let's hope that the presentation does, fits with that description and that introduction. Really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be able to give a seminar in person again, and it's my first time in Fort Collins, so it's also great to, visit a new place. So yeah, let me get going. I tried to prepare like a kind of broad overview of what we're doing in Puerto Rico, because I'm assuming that not everybody is stream ecologist interested in macroinvertebrates like I am, so I tried to just make it a little broad. But if somebody's interested in more detail, I'll be happy to chat later. So let me take you to Puerto Rico. So, sorry, forgot my presentation. So I have the overview. So I'll tell you about Puerto Rico, then I'll tell you about the climate change predictions and major disturbances that we're facing and we're expecting to face. Then I'll talk about our research in stream ecosystems and then some of our future plans. This is kind of an interesting setup. You guys kind of have to look at me and look at this side, look at me. So let's go to Puerto Rico now. So as you know, Puerto Rico is an island in the middle of the Caribbean. I like to emphasize that because I grew up in Costa Rica, and that sounds similar to Puerto Rico, so that can get confusing. But Costa Rica is somewhere out of the map here in Central America. Puerto Rico is this little island in the Caribbean. It is an oceanic island with a lot of rivers. So all these blue lines here are streams and rivers draining Puerto Rico. It's a very rainy place. Most of the island, it has a drier area in the west and southwest, but we mostly work in the east part that is more rainy with a lot more precipitation. Stream food webs look like this. So again, it's an oceanic island, so biodiversity is a little low relative to, let's say, continental streams. And if any of you have worked in or visited South America, diversity is super high. Puerto Rico is really poor in diversity, but it's still a very interesting place. So here, if you are looking at a stream below a waterfall, you'll see basically a lot of microorganisms like Meiofauna. Aquatic insects are always present. Then you have crabs. There's only one species on the island. Shrimp are very important, and I'll show you a little video soon. And then fish. The thing with fish is that they are mostly amphidromous, so they have to move to the ocean at some point. The larvae tends to drift with the flow and develop in the estuary or in the ocean before they migrate back into the river. So below waterfalls, you have a lot of fish. It's like this mountain mullet here. But then above waterfalls, we lose that component. So they cannot climb waterfalls or pass dams. So above waterfalls, it's like shrimp heaven. It's the perfect place because there isn't any predatory organisms, and shrimp are at the top of the food web. And they are really cool. So I'm going to share a little bit of this video. Let's hope it works. I think I need to change the pointer. And this is a video that Alan Kovic helped us put together. It's a video developed by Freshwater Illustrated, a company that focuses on creating really nice underwater videos. I know it doesn't have sound. Alan is there narrating, and you probably know Alan Kovic, most of you. He's there narrating his experience with shrimp and how these organisms are super abundant. There's Alan. And how shrimp are super important within the aquatic ecosystem in Puerto Rico. And that's one of the crabs. So shrimp are, in those places above waterfalls, shrimp are at the top of the food web, and they are super abundant. Like in a little pool, you can get 50, 60 shrimp. And sometimes they crawl on your legs if you just kind of walk in. So they can be a little annoying as well. Another characteristic of the streams in Puerto Rico, especially in the east part, is that they are really flashy. So these are the two graphs showing the hydrograph of Prieta, one of our study streams. And you can see that the water goes up and down all the time. And streams are also very steep in this area, in the east part of the island. So you get a lot of big floods. So that's the same stream. The picture above is during base flow, and the video below is during one of the regular floods that we get after a storm. So this is not unusual. That happens on a regular basis. So it goes up and down, up and down. So all the native species are or have some type of adaptation to deal with floods. So floods are kind of like a part of their life cycle. They are adapted to them. And then the other characteristic that Puerto Rico has is that it's in the middle of the Caribbean, and we get hurricanes all the time. Not direct hits, but a storm goes by every year during hurricane season from June to November. There's always some storm affecting the islands. And that also affects the dynamics of the ecosystem. Direct heat, like a hurricane affecting Puerto Rico directly, is more rare. So that happens more like once every 60 years, like major hurricane affecting Puerto Rico. But every year, there's some storm that is affecting the island. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that climate change it's affecting, or climate change is expected to impact Puerto Rico in two important ways. One, it's the prediction that we'll get more droughts. So precipitation is expected to decrease over the Caribbean, and drought events are going to become more frequent, at least as part of the projection. And the other projection is that even in years when drought doesn't occur, the dry season might extend. I mean, there isn't really much of a dry season, but the summer is going to become a little drier. And that's a little bit of a concern because that's when shrimp also reproduce. And because they are also amphibians, the larvae has to move to the ocean, at least to the estuary, to complete the life cycle. So if we have less rain during the summer, that might affect also the life cycle of shrimp. They might not be able to migrate all the way to the ocean. And then hurricanes, we might get maybe not more hurricanes, but more intense hurricanes. So hurricanes of higher category might be more common in the future. So the summary is that droughts and hurricanes are going to become more frequent in the future. And that's kind of like the focus of our research in stream ecosystems in Puerto Rico. We're trying to find out how droughts and hurricanes might be affecting the streams. And just by chance, those things that ecologists get excited about, but regular people hate, we got a major drought during 2015, and then a major hurricane during 2017. And it's one of those things that you hear that a hurricane is going towards Puerto Rico, and everybody is scared, preparing their houses and all that. And ecologists are collecting data to have pre-disturbance data. So I was in Puerto Rico when that happened, but it was a major event, but we collected data before the hurricane. So let's talk about the stream responses to hurricanes, or how they get impacted. So we're working in the Luquillo Experimental Forest, which is here in this spot in the northeast side of the island. It is an LTR site, so it's a long-term ecological research site, and was funded in 1988. So Luquillo has a really long-term data set for many variables. There, we're working in a little stream that we call Prieta. And Prieta has two branches that we're very creative, so we call it A and B. But those are really similar in size and very useful, not as replicates, but at least to have two sites that are comparable. So during the 2015 drought, it was a pan-Caribbean event. So everything here in brown was affected by drought. So that drought was so important, so intense, that people in Puerto Rico end up getting water twice a week during the peak of the drought. Like, we got water at home during Sunday and Wednesday, and then no water the rest of the week. For a rainy island, that was shocking. I mean, that was really, really odd. And that didn't, it's not something that happened on a regular basis. That was, I think the previous drought event was in 1994. So, long time between that type of event. The stream became or changed from a flowing ecosystem to a series of disconnected pools. So you can see more or less the watermark here in this rock where I draw the line, and a little pool. So that was a flowing stream. That was a pool in the stream. And during the peak of the drought, it was just basically an isolated little lake there. And I think there's something odd with my animation, so my apologies. There we go. So we summarized, we were working in Puerto before the drought. So we summarized all the information that we had and published it in a paper that Paulo led. Paulo was a PhD student with me at that point. And it basically, or droughts affect stream in two different ways. One, the reduction in flow, and I know you guys cannot read this very well, but I'll just highlight it here quickly. So the reduction in flow affects the connectivity among pools and also isolate pools. And then let me just make a parenthesis, like for this type of stream, pools are the main habitat. Most of the time, stream ecologists like to work on riffles because that's where the water is flowing, the substrate is more heterogeneous. But these streams are so steep that pools are basically connected by little falls, little steps, or really small riffles. So pool habitats are the main place to focus on. So the drought basically transformed this stream, this flowing ecosystem into a series of isolated pools. And the other way that affects the stream is by affecting riparian vegetation. So when you have a drought, there's water stress on the forest as well. So there's a lot of leaf litter falling into the stream. It's kind of like when you travel and forget to water your plants, when you go back, all the leaves are on the ground. Same thing happens during a drought in the stream. So you get a pulse of organic matter and a bunch of pools that are not flowing. So oxygen goes really low, and the organisms have to deal with that new type of condition. So I'm going to show you here what we found in terms of macroinvertebrate responses. I'll give you more details later. So before the drought, so this is 2014 and 2015, the beginning of the drought year, we had around 1,000 individuals per square meter. I'm just showing you total macroinvertebrate abundance. During the drought, during the peak of the drought, that increased a lot, close to over 9,000 individuals per square meter. And after the drought, that went down again to around 1,000. So if we look just at total abundance here, very broadly, you can see that there's a major increase in macroinvertebrates in those isolated pools. But when we look at the composition, we realize that not all the groups were abundant. It was mostly things like oligochaetes that became super abundant during the drought because they can deal with low oxygen. So we got also a lot of chironomids, the ones that have that are red. If you guys know aquatic insects, there are some small chironomids, small insect larvae that can deal with low oxygen conditions. They became super abundant, and the rest basically disappear. And I'll show you more details in a minute. But we got this drought and the climate models saying that droughts were going to become more frequent. So we start, getting ready to study drought and getting ready to try to understand what happened when flow goes down and when the pools become disconnected and all that. And when we were ready for that, Maria showed up. And we got a super major hurricane that crossed Puerto Rico from one corner to the other. And you can see it here on top of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is right there in the middle, so it doesn't really matter where the eye of the storm crossed. It basically hit the island completely. I was living in Puerto Rico, and it is quite an experience to live through a hurricane. It's like after the hurricane, when the hurricane is over, you walk outside, and first thing you realize is that you're on your own. There's no electricity, there's no water, there's no cell phone. not even the radio works. You might have batteries and everything, but there's nothing to listen to. It was quite shocking. It's like suddenly you realize that your neighbors are the only people that you can count with. And some of them I didn't even know. So it is quite an experience. For the stream ecosystem, the hurricane created two things. One, it created a major flood, like in this picture that I showed you before. So during the storm, there's a lot of precipitation, so the hurricane creates a big flood in the stream. And the other thing that it happens is that all this vegetation that was shading the stream disappears. And this is El Verde Field Station. Before the hurricane, you see the canopy, see the palms, tropical forest. And after the storm, it's like a bunch of standing trunks without branches, without leaves. All those leaves are on the ground. A lot of them are in the stream. So there's a pulse of detritus that falls into the stream ecosystem. And so we have to basically forget the drought for a while and focus on the hurricane. And so we went back to the stream to sample. And here I'm showing you the pre-hurricane, post-drought, pre-hurricane period. You see the up and downs in macroinvertebrates. And then the hurricane hit Puerto Rico in September. And I'm gonna delete this part of the drought and just show you the remaining of this one data set. And here you see September really low, but then nothing really. So it was really interesting. It was very surprising. So we got this big flood, but I imagine that aquatic organisms are like one more flood. So, might not, we get them all the time. So they decrease in numbers, but they bounce it again quickly, at least when we look at the total abundance. And then, yeah, we have some changes towards the following year that I'll show you more detail in a minute. But when you look at this time series that I'm showing you, and this is work that one of my grad students, Marieli Vega, is working on, you can see that at least from this data set, the drought has a larger impact on macroinvertebrates than the hurricane, at least when you look at the total abundance of macroinvertebrates. When we look at the composition, things are slightly different. So here we have an ordination analysis. For those of you that are not familiar with ordination, points that are close to each other are similar in macroinvertebrate composition, and points that are separate or distant are dissimilar. So here in red, we have the drought, the peak of the drought. So June, July, and September 2015 were drought months, or drought, the drought period. And then the ones in blue are the immediately post-hurricane months. And then here you have 2018, kind of a few months after the hurricane. And clearly you can see that the drought months, the samples that we collected during the drought go towards one corner in this ordination. That means that the composition of macroinvertebrate was dissimilar from the remaining of the cloud of samples. And I show you the oligochaetes, so that's basically that. So the diversity and the composition changed, biased towards oligochaetes and organisms that are tolerant to low oxygen. But then you cannot really tell the hurricane from the rest of the cloud. So some of these are pre-hurricane. Here we have November 2014. So this cloud of point is kind of like the regular variability in assemblage composition, except that you get these points up here that are from, say, like 4 to 6 months after the hurricane. And we think that those are related with the canopy opening. So, like you have the pulse of leaf litter, but the trees stay without leaves for several months. That means more sunlight hitting the channel. That probably means more algae. That might mean a change in resources. So we look at that more closely. Here we have canopy cover in this graph. So you have percent cover versus time. Before the hurricane, the canopy cover was 90%, something like that, so really shaded. And then the hurricane hit, and canopy cover went down to like 10%. And it was shocking to go to the stream and have to use sunblock. Like used to be shaded, like you never worry about the sun unless you went to the beach. But then in the middle of the rainforest, we were just, roasting. And here you have some pictures. That's before the hurricane. Then immediately after the hurricane in September, so that's the same month that the hurricane hit, and then some recovery by 2020. Still, by 2020, you see that there's or maybe you cannot see it very well, but it's still open, still sunnier than it's supposed to be. So we start looking at we went back to the data and start looking at the macroinvertebrates by functional groups, trying to see whether things that consume detritus versus things that consume algae were responding on a different way. So here I'm showing you Josue's dissertation work. He worked with Meiofauna, and he divided the different Meiofauna in functional groups. So Meiofauna are tiny, really small things that only Josue knows, like amoebas, rotifers, and tiny baby aquatic insects. So really, really tiny stuff. And in this ordination, we label things in blue as pre-hurricane. So that's like under shaded, the stream completely shaded. The red is immediately after the hurricane, so that's after that big flood. But algae probably didn't respond yet. And then in green, it's a few months after the hurricane, so basically starting in January 2018. And we selected January because it's the beginning of the dry season, dry again, in quote unquote, because it's always rainy. But at least it's a period where you get less disturbance from flood. So more chance for algae to grow and stay there available for consumers. And you can see that things group nicely. So we didn't select the categories before seeing the results. we basically divided things and then run the analysis. But the community changed. And when we look at different groups, you can see the pattern. So here you have herbivores. They were rare before the hurricane, and they increased it after. And even a few months after, they were abundant. Things that consume bacteria were the ones that responded more strongly, but they only responded right after the hurricane. So they basically responded to that pulse of detritus that fell in the stream. And then they went down again to pre-hurricane abundance right after. A few months after the hurricane. And aquatic insects do the same. So these are just looking at aquatic insects instead of the total, looking at things that are collector-gatherers, meaning that they consume fine particles, and things that are scrapers. So aquatic insects that are consuming algae and biofilm from rocks. The line here that is kind of small, it's when the hurricane happened. So you see pre-hurricane here in 2017. Then for collector-gatherers, you see a peak after the hurricane, and then drops again to kind of like pre-hurricane conditions. For things that are consuming algae, scraping algae from rocks, you see a more delayed response. So it took them until 2018 to increase in numbers, and then they kind of fluctuated, but tended to decrease. So we're assuming that they are responding basically to that increase in sunlight, that increased algal availability, and biofilms. And we look at shrimp as well. And the data set here is a little messier because I'm including all of shrimp. Chu, or Jesus, it's working on this data set. And I'm missing some pictures here. There we go. But the overall trend is something that Alan Kovich described it before for Puerto Rico. When there's a hurricane, that pulse of energy and then the opening of the canopy increases resources for shrimp. So you see kind of like an increase and a decrease later. So it's like a hump. And I know it's not very obvious in this graph, but when you look at the different taxa individually, it's easier to spot. And that seems to be also a response to that change in resources, algae being higher quality. So the hypothesis, we need to look at this more in detail, but the hypothesis is that this hump here is basically an algal response. Now we also look at particular taxa more in detail. So this guy here is Philoicus. It's a shredder, so it's an insect that cuts pieces of leaf to make its case. It's a caddisfly that built this funny case, but it's also consuming leaves. And we use stable isotopes to find out, to investigate what was its main food resource. And before the hurricane, leaf litter was the dominant carbon source for its biomass. And then right after the hurricane, I'm sorry, this is leaf litter and this is algae, in explaining the graph before I tell you the story. So before the hurricane, leaf litter was the dominant one. And you can see clearly that the signal for leaf litter is higher than the algal signal. And then, having animation problems, I apologize. And then by November, they flip and they start showing a signal that is enriched by algae. So it seems to be that they run out of leaves and start consuming algae, or they were consuming leaves that were colonized by algae, either way, because they might not be able to separate leaves from algae. They have to consume the whole resource. But the algal signal increased by the end of 2017, and it kind of went back to the previous one a year after by summer 2018. And this is, again, work that Pablo is putting together right now. So the story is not complete, but we're trying to get it in shape, and we'll probably submit it for publication soon. So overall, for the hurricanes and the droughts, we think that droughts are causing conditions that are more unusual than hurricanes, at least in the sense that droughts are very rare and change the stream ecosystem so much that you see impacts on the macroinvertebrate assemblage that are very drastic. So you kind of basically lose the flow of water, and the community, the assemblage of macroinvertebrates changes quite a bit. The hurricane causes a large flood, but those are recurrent disturbances, and the organisms have a way to deal with them. Either they get knocked by the storm, but they recover quickly, so they are resilient, or they have adaptations like shrimp. They can crawl under rocks and they can hold their place, so they are more resistant to that type of disturbance. So the flood is not probably a big issue, but the opening of the canopy does change the trophic basis of the food web. And if hurricanes become more frequent, that canopy might stay more open or stay open for longer, and that might result in a change in the ecosystem from algal to, from alloctonous to algal resources. So that's the story for hurricanes and drought, but we still have the drought question pending, right? We have to put it on hold because the hurricane basically changed everything. So our plans are to go back to the drought question this year, and future steps for the project in Puerto Rico are to use Prieta, the 2 branches, to do a flow reduction. So here I don't have any data to show you. I'll just show you the plans. Our idea is to use Prieta B as the experimental branch and bypass a section of Prieta by piping basically water and creating a flow reduction. And doing that during the beginning of the year, that is supposed to be the drier part of the year, and extending that over summer as the models predict, and then maintaining Prieta A as our reference. And Prieta B is the perfect place to do it because it has this major bedrock outcrop in the headwaters, and it has this little channel here. So most of the flow from the stream during base flow goes through this little channel. So we built a structure that captures water from here, sends the water into a pipe, and then bypasses like 100 meter reach, and puts the water back downstream. And the idea then is to repeat that flow reduction annually to simulate the recurrence of this component of the drought. So it's not a drought simulation because we're not affecting the riparian vegetation, but it's a flow reduction, which is one of the main components of drought. So I'll show you the timeline. Like, we actually started thinking about this project after the 2015 drought, but we got the hurricane, so we have to switch gears from our drought project to a hurricane recovery project. But the plan is to start the flow reduction this year and maintain it recurrent over several years. I'm not sure how many years. This is like a wish list. But then eventually, if we get funding, because this is all projected, we'll mix it with canopy trimming so we can affect also the amount of sunlight hitting the channel. And we think that the fact that canopy cover is heading up is not to what it was before the hurricane. So you see that it's still low, below the pre-hurricane levels, but it's close enough. So we're hoping that we are going to get or there is a good timing to do the flow reduction. And the other thing that we're doing is trying to get as much data as possible before we do the flow reduction. So we're measuring everything we can. So we're measuring environmental variables, like this long list, water chemistry and all that, organic matter, riparian vegetation, and biotic responses, like chlorophyll, macroinvertebrates, shrimp abundance and fecundity, and food web structure using isotopes. And of course, I need to clarify that this is not just my lab. This is teamwork with a lot of people from the Luquillo LTR. Chu is our project coordinator. We have people from the University of Georgia, from New Hampshire, the LTR has many people involved, a lot of grad students, our technician Gustavo, and a lot of helpers from volunteers. So this is basically a major team effort. And here is our test. So we actually run the flow reduction for a few days to see whether we were going to be able to decrease flow. So you can see that it started, and it went steadily down, and then we achieved like a 40% reduction of flow, which is similar to the drought. So we're pretty happy that the flow reduction is going to work. And the pictures, this is moving by itself. And the pictures here are showing a pool before we started the flow reduction and after at the end. So this is one of the little pools close to the water intake. So it's one of the ones that are most affected by the reduction. And you can see that it basically disappears. And again, just emphasizing that we're kind of following this part of our conceptual model, the part about reducing flow and isolating pools and changing habitat conditions for macroinvertebrates and shrimp. So it's not a drought simulation, it's just a flow reduction. We're not affecting the riparian vegetation, or we don't think that we're going to affect the riparian vegetation. But the idea is to do it over and over so we can simulate the effects of recurring droughts. And this is just highlighting the data that or how we're going to use the data. So we have been monitoring a bunch of variables since the hurricanes. Here I'm just showing some examples. This is pool depth, leaf litter inputs, shrimp abundance, and macroinvertebrates. So the idea is to use this data set as kind of hurricane recovery and also pre-flow reduction data. And I can tell you more about the details of the experiment if you guys want. But that's basically the goal for this year. And it sounds exciting. We're really excited about starting this new project. And that's my story. I hope it wasn't too broad or too general. And I'll be happy to answer questions if you guys have any.
Just please use the mic so we can capture them on the recording. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Thanks for the talk. So I know from the paper that we discussed earlier in the week that that idea is that the drought projections are increasingly frequent. What's the Atlantic Basin hurricane? I've read a whole range of stuff on that. So what's the best guess for the frequency of hurricanes?
That's a really good question because there isn't a lot of consensus about it, I think. It's just that the number of storms every year is going to remain similar. The proportion, I guess, of major storms, category 3 and 4 or 5, are expected to increase. But it isn't very specific besides that. I think modeling hurricanes is still a tricky business. And other than an increase in intensity, there isn't really much else, as far as I know. Yeah. But I guess for Puerto Rico, basically means that the chances of being hit by a major storm are increasing. So we had like maybe once every 60 years frequency for major hurricanes that will drop, but not sure how much. I hope not too much because otherwise it's going to be really, really bad. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering what you thought, or what you know about how the detritus moves through this system. So you said with the hurricane, the leaves all fell into the stream, and then presumably it's flooding at the same time. And when I think of a stream, I see like accumulations where, the eddies where the detritus accumulates, and thinking about pools and maybe some pools where the detritus might wash through and not necessarily stay. And then how might that interact with drought, where then that water level drops and some pools might have a lot of detritus or very little? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting dynamics because the hurricane creates this major flood, so there's a lot of export of detritus during the flood. But so much stuff falls and so many branches and trees fall that after the hurricane, you end up with a lot of debris dams. So it's like a change of debris dams, then a stretch of stream without much detritus, then a debris dam. And those debris dams kind of start collapsing slowly over time. So they kind of like add detritus to the stream little by little over the few months after the storm. But there is a major export. So if hurricanes hit more often, you expect like these pulses of detritus to occur. But I think those are probably just temporary because they end up being exported downstream eventually. And the opening of the canopy is kind of like the more permanent impact. And if you have a mixture or a combination of kind of dry conditions after a hurricane, then that will affect quite a bit the dynamics of the detritus. It's kind of hard to say in which direction. This Hurricane Maria was followed by a period of like a rainy season, like a more wet period. So we got a lot of export of detritus and very little accumulation. The previous hurricane that hit Puerto Rico was George in 1998, was what some people call a dry hurricane. So you got the hurricane, and then the following months were very dry. And the dynamics was apparently very different in the sense that the detritus stayed there for longer, so it was more accessible to consumers. While after Maria, the following rains exported all that. So yeah, it would be a completely different dynamics if you get a lot more rain or a lot more drought after one of those storms. But yeah, it is kind of difficult to predict.
Chris.
I was just curious, with the hurricane essentially eliminating the canopy, whether you saw a change in the quality of the leaf litter then falling in post-hurricane or pre-hurricane, if you have younger leaves falling in post-hurricane. Did that change anything at all?
Yeah, for sure. One thing that we noticed, I mean, we haven't analyzed the leaf litter quality yet, but we have the samples. But one of the things that we noticed is that, well, first you have a period without any inputs of leaf litter because there isn't any really to fall into the channel. But a lot of the shading after a few months, it's actually like pioneer species that are growing in the riparian zone. So the main canopy trees that were there, they take longer to recover and to and they grow leaves, but lateral branches and leaves that actually cover the channel take much longer to recover. So a lot of the shading that we get a year, 2 years after the hurricane, it's basically pioneer species that are taking advantage of the opening and the sunny area. And those tend to be richer in nitrogen. So we get a lot of Cecropia falling into the stream. That's a pioneer species that is high in nitrogen. So I would imagine that resources change in quality quite a bit from pre-hurricane, just based on the species composition and what is shading the channel. But that's one data set that is still pending because it basically takes quite a bit of steps to get there. But yeah, we want to look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio of those leaves and try to find out whether there's a major shift in the quality. But based on the species, I would say that, yeah, there's gonna be an increase in quality right after, or like a year after. It's not that soon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm curious, at the start of your talk, you show those photographs and those food webs with and without fish. My suspicion is that hurricanes and droughts would have really different effects on those different communities, whether you have fish present or not. Is that indeed the case?
Well, my only experience with that is our urban work that I'll share tomorrow. And there we did have an interesting effect in like droughts, opening the door for introduced species to become established. So the hypothesis being that, you know, these streams are so flashy that natives have an advantage because they are adapted to that flashy hydrograph. And invasives, you know, have a hard time dealing with that condition. The drought kind of flips things towards more stable flow, and that kind of opens the door for invasives. And some of them, once established, might be able to stay there even if the hydrology becomes flashy again. So yeah, I guess my gut feeling is that it does change the dynamics if you're working below a waterfall, and if invasives are around. So yeah, that's something that I haven't seen much done about, and the only data that we have are from urban streams that are already under some degree of stress because of the urbanization.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question that is probably quite naive from an aquatic macroinvertebrate perspective, ecology of aquatic macroinvertebrates, but it seemed really striking to me that during the drought, the community was dominated. One, there are lots of individuals, and there was dominated by the worms and the chironomids, I think. And then after the drought, your data suggested that the composition really returned pretty closely to pre-drought. And so I'm just wondering where all that dispersal comes from. Is it individuals like within the stream that are able to hunker down and so they're not making up much of the community, but they come back? Or is it most of these things fly? I suppose not shrimp.
Right.
Yeah, the insects anyway will fly. So do you know where they come from?
No, that's an excellent question, and I would say that maybe both, because I mean the drought lasted for a few months only. So the peak of the drought was during July. By October, we got tropical systems going by and adding precipitation and basically changing the drought conditions. So any insects that were able to fly around and stay as adults during the drought period were able to lay eggs and kind of restart the community. So I would imagine that there's a recolonization. And then our study site is a headwater stream, so yeah, that got the pools isolated. But if you go downstream, you might still have some flow, and even when the habitat shrunk, maybe still flow conditions that might provide a source of colonizers for the headwaters. But yeah, we haven't looked into that. It is, I would imagine, like a mixture of both, like the drought being kind of like short-term, few months, and colonization from downstream, maybe. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Thanks.
Something to look into.
Other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Alonso and go out to where we have food and drink. Thank you so much. And as you heard, tomorrow we'll learn about urban streams.